What's up, Wizards? It's the Dirty D from Mtg, Magic Talk and all that. Today I'm finally gonna do it. Been talking about it for 2 weeks, might as well be about it. And today seemed like a pretty good day to do the tier list because as of today, Ikoria Behemoths is finally out in paper. You can get it if you want to get it. But we've already had access to the set for like a month now, it feels like a pretty good long time. But did you know, another little tidbit I want to insert into the conversation, we're only like a month away from Core Set 2021 spoilers. So if I'm going to do this, I need to probably go ahead and do it. So let's rank all of the best decks in Standard right now based on what little data we actually have. Normally we'd have more than this, right? But like there's kind of a thing going on in the world. So most of my data is going to come from 5.0 League results, as well as standard events that have been on MTGO, and I've been using a site called MTG Melee. Big shout out to MTG Melee. This video is not sponsored by them or anything, but they are a really good online source that kind of aggregates a bunch of the smaller tournaments thrown by online vendors, and especially in a world where like every data point counts, they've been a really good source for me. So I'll leave a link to them down there in the description box, as well as every single deck that we talk about today. It's like 15 different decks. I'll leave links to their deck list in the description for, again, every single thing that we talk about. Because for the most part, there's Ziggy's tail. For the most part, I'm going to talk as though, you know, you're knowledgeable in the standard meta and you know what most of these decks and cards and whatnot are. But in case you do get a little bit lost and you don't know a specific card or strategy or interaction I'm talking about, again, I'll leave links in the description to the deck list. But that is pretty much all I got to say before we get going here. So let's go ahead and start with the C tier. We're going to kind of start here and work our way up for suspense reasons. That's how you make a YouTube video. But anyway, you could just fast forward until the very end if you wanted to know what the best deck is, but whatever. I mean, it's all about the journey and not necessarily the destination. So I'll start in the C tier with, I guess, the worst best deck in Standard. And I feel like I have to mention Garuda somewhere in here. So that Gyarados is the first deck I'm going to talk about, because even though this deck is kind of a meme, let's be honest here, you know, it was kind of a huge deck that a lot of people were talking about for the first like 2 weeks of Standard. It really hasn't stood up to the evolution of the format, because the format's evolved like a lot since Garuda was like one of the big decks everyone was worried about, and you don't really see it on the ladder very much anymore, but you also rarely see it actually pick up results in the MTGO leagues or in these smaller sort of online tournaments that have been being thrown lately that you find the results for on Melee. So you just don't really see Garuda pop up anymore, but it's still kind of a force. It's one of those decks where if you're not prepared for it, you know, your deck has to be ready for turn 4 Garuda in some way or another, or you can just lose on the spot. But there are other times where the Garuda deck like goes off on turn 4 the way it wants to and still just doesn't spin up the right thing. So there's like a really high degree of variance there, and just because you actually get Garuda on turn 4 or turn 5 doesn't mean that you like auto win the game. And decks that have the sort of play patterns that a deck like Garuda has really needs to win the game on its like big combo turn, its hero turn. And this deck doesn't always do that. It very often passes turn. That could be a huge problem. So there's just major issues with Garuda, and even if you get it down, if you don't win the game right then and there, you get Shatter the Sky or something, and then you're back to square one. And it doesn't feel very good, and there are multiple decks that are prepared for Garuda in this format. So I think that Gyarados isn't necessarily the force that we thought it was going to be at the beginning of the format, but it's still something that decks need to be prepared for. And if I had to pick like a worse best deck to sort of start the list off, it's definitely Garuda. It's still something that a lot of people are playing with, even though you don't see it on the ladder as much anymore. It's still something that a lot of people sort of committed wildcards to in the early going in the format, and they're going to make this deck work, dang it. So you do come across it every now and again, and it still has its benefactors and proponents and all that. But for the most part, it's just not a deck that's really taken seriously too much in the format anymore. And there are definitely reasons for that. It's a little unstable. The degree of variance is way too high. And it's mostly kind of a Game 1 deck that has no really good, better options in Games 2 and 3. And that can kind of hinder it too. Just one of those all-in sort of rampy combo decks that, even when it goes off, is not the best deck in the world. But I guess the next it's actually worst best deck is a deck that popped up a little bit at the beginning of the season. People talked about it, and then it fell off completely for like 2 weeks. And now it's starting to see results again as of this late date. And that's Lurrus Knights. And again, this deck popped up in a couple of different forms at the beginning of the season. I tried it out, hated it. I went like 0-6 with this deck when I first started playing it. Did not care for it at all. But again, it's been popping up more in results over the last week and a half, 2 weeks. And I weight those a little bit higher than if you did well at the beginning of the season, you know? Because a lot of decks did well at the beginning of the season that aren't very good right now. And Standard's evolving at such a fast pace at the moment that, you know, wins that you get in the last week are weighted much more highly than wins that you got, 3 weeks ago. So the fact that Lurrus Knights is posting some results does put it into sort of, it makes the cut for this video. But I still don't think it's like the best deck, especially when it comes to, weighing all the aggro decks in the format, what aggro decks there actually are against one another. I think that Lurrus Knights has some pretty cool things that it's doing, but it's still not as good as most of the other aggro decks, and it still falls to a lot of the sort of more control-y decks that play a lot of sweepers and whatnot. Lurrus doesn't always get you out of those tight spots. But Lurrus does a lot of good things for this deck. It didn't already have, like you can leverage cards like Worthy Knight a lot better now. You get a lot more tokens out of it. Like Tournament Grounds gives you a pretty good reason to play the deck, because Tournament Grounds is the only thing that makes like a 3-color aggro deck playable. And there's other cool things that the deck does, Corpse Knight is a lot better when you got Lurrus around, because you're always going to be able to play your Corpse Knight out of the graveyard, and whenever you do play other creatures out of your graveyard with Lurrus, you get extra damage from Corpse Knight. So, again, things like Worthy Knight and Corpse Knight needed that sort of, that extra hand, because they're already decent cards, but they have huge targets on their back. They're really easy to take out because they're low toughness and all that, so you needed a way to be able to play those cards out of your graveyard. So Lurrus does really help the deck, supercharge a couple of cards that were already decent but needed an extra bit of help. But still, there's better aggro decks in the format. Like, for instance, Gruul Aggro, which is the next deck in C tier. And this is one that I think is one of the better aggro decks in the format. It's definitely, in my opinion at least, better than Knights, but the results say that as well. The LATAM event, the Latin America, Norte America Open, that was just held last weekend. Gruul Aggro won that event, and it's been pretty decent in the MTGO League lately. It usually shows up in at least one spot. It did very well in an MTGO event last week, so the deck has been popping up more and more lately, and I can see why. If you're going to play an aggro deck, this has some really big, meaty dudes in it, and not every aggro deck does, so there's at least that much, but the real key to this deck is actually the haste. Like, most of its creatures haste. You got Questing Beast, Robber the Rich, Zertog Goblin, Shifting Ceratops, which a lot of decks are playing in the main deck now, so it's like anti-Agent of Treachery tech because it's got Probe Blue. But it can also haste. And haste is just really good in a world of like Teferis and Elspeth Conquers Depths and Shatters the Sky and stuff like that. Like stuff your opponent has to wait until they untap on their next turn to actually play, because it's all sorcery speed. Except in the case where they can like Shatter the Sky at instant speed because they have Teferi out. That happens, but still haste is a really, really good weapon in this format, where it's, you can play a big creature, but if you say go, your opponent has like a million different options for answers and stuff. So haste creatures are actually super good right now, especially if you're trying to get the jump on the opponent and win as quickly as possible. These haste creatures make this maybe the best Embercleave deck in the format right now, it's kind of amazing, because Mono Red in its traditional form over the last like month, really Mono Red in its traditional form since Throne of Eldraine came out, is not even on this list, where it was the #1 deck like 2 lists in a row. But it's really fallen off for a variety of reasons. And I guess we'll discuss those as the video goes on. But right now, if you're going to play Embercleave in the format, I think this is probably the premier Embercleave deck. But we started C tier with a meme deck, and I guess we'll end it with a meme deck. Because I think better than any other deck in C tier is Winota, but I don't think that it's quite good enough to be in B tier. It produces results occasionally. It's gotten, top 8, although not 1 or top 3 or top 4. But it's still top 8 at a couple of recent online events. It usually shows up at least once in MTGO League results. And I believe it also top 8'd a standard challenge in the last week and a half. So it has produced some results recently, which is pretty cool because, Winota, again, just like Garuda, was one of these huge major forces. What are we going to do about this deck at the beginning of the season? And since then, it's kind of fallen off. But it's produced results a lot more frequently and consistently than Garuda has. It still produces results more frequently and consistently. And it's sort of more grandfathered into the format than decks like Lurrus Knights and Gruul Aggro, which have only really seen intermittent play, and only recently for that matter. So, I think Winota has not necessarily proven yet that it's one of the actual like top tier best decks in the format. But it can definitely, just like Garuda, take opponents by surprise, and if you're not ready for a turn 4 Winota, your game's just over. Right, but a lot of the better decks in the format are prepared for a turn 4 Winota to either counter it or remove it before they get to their attack step or whatever. So there's just ways that Winota can win if the Winota player goes first. Right, that can be a huge deal. If the opponent doesn't have early removal against, either Raise the Alarm or Legion War Boss or something like that, then things can get a little bit, iffy. And if they do hit Agent of Treachery off Winota, then again, things can just be, can go south really quickly. But again, just like Garuda, sometimes the Winota deck doesn't win on turn 4. The turn that it gets its big combo turned down, plays Winota, attacks with 3 non-human creatures, gets down 1 Agent of Treachery and steals the thing. That doesn't necessarily guarantee the win. And then again, if you get hit by Shatter the Sky or something, it's back to square one, and your opponent's a lot more likely to win those games. So I think Winota is probably a much better deck than Garuda in a lot of ways. I think that there's a lot more dimensions to it. And it plays sort of better card quality overall in a lot of its slots, but it's still relegated to have to play cards like Raise the Alarm, right? So there's still kind of an issue of card quality in the Winota deck, but I think that if you're going to do something stupid on turn 4, and when it comes down to I either want to play the meme deck Garuda or the meme deck Winota. I think Winota is the far stronger deck in the format and has more outs if its plan doesn't immediately pop off the way it wants to. So if I had to pick a best deck in C tier, it's probably Winota. It's definitely a deck you still absolutely have to respect. Let's start at the B tier here with a deck that we've seen before, but you might not have expected to see in this video, and that's Temur Adventures, amazingly, which has been making a comeback lately, and I mean in the last week. Temur Adventures has been making a comeback. I've seen a lot of people talk about this deck, and I've seen this deck produce some actual results too in the MTGO leagues. So again, this is a deck that people have renewed interest in over the last week, and there are reasons for that. Again, it's produced results, but the word on the street is that this is sort of the great hope against the Yorion decks, the various Fires decks in the format that play Yorion and Lukka and whatnot, because this is said to just embarrass their primary and secondary plans. I'm not sure if that's true in practice, but again, the deck has been producing results again as of late, and that probably means that is as a result of being pretty good against some of the top decks in the format. You have a lot of card advantage in this deck, and the game going long really only benefits you. You don't present all the targets in the world to your opponent for your opponent's stuff, so that's a huge deal as well. Until you want to actually go off, and even then, before you go off, some of the targets you do present to your opponents, like Agent of Treachery, are not great steals. In the Temur Adventures, I guess you can have my Brazen Borrower. I guess you can have my Edgewalling Keeper. I'd rather have it, but you can have a 1/1 that doesn't do anything for you. So, there are definitely some, they can whiff on some stuff. You also get Fae of Wishes, which is very good, actually, against a fair amount of the I don't want to say mid-range plans in the format, but a lot of these kind of combo-y plans, like Yorion, like Fires, that are in the format right now. Fae of Wishes can be very, very good against to go fetch up answers from your board and stuff. So, Lucky Clover is still a good card. Edgewall Innkeeper is still a ton of, actual card advantage. And the Temur Adventures, late-game plan of, flinging a Beanstalk Giant or something is still, just as viable as it's ever been, and worth a pretty good bit. So, and this deck actually does get to the later game pretty well. It's obviously got no issues with card advantage because all of its creatures are also spells and you're drawing cards the whole time. There's just really nothing necessarily wrong with the Temur Adventures deck other than it takes a while to get going, but we're in a format that affords you a couple of turns, in most cases, to get your plan sort of up and running and your shields up and all your important pieces like Clover down. So we're in an environment that doesn't seem as hostile to Temur Adventures as past environments. The Temur Adventures was a good deck in, so I'm not surprised that people, again, have sort of a renewed interest in it and that it is climbing the ladder a little bit more in recent days. But up next in the B tier is another of many Temur decks. There's at least 3 Temur decks on the list here. But in any case, we'll talk about Genesis Elementals next. This deck is only ahead of Temur Adventures because it has produced more actual solid results in the data as of the last couple of weeks. But it is only a week and a half or 2 weeks old. This is a fairly fresh deck that people have been playing with. and it hasn't actually done as well in the MTGO League results as I would have liked, but it has been picking up a lot of spots in the top 8s of smaller online tournaments held by vendors and others. Jeff Hooglin put up a tournament a couple of weeks ago, and I think this deck was in it, but that's neither here. Maybe it wasn't. That's actually neither here nor there. Scratch that from the record. But this deck has been popping up a lot in these online events lately. I believe it did really well in a standard event, a standard challenge over the last week. So again, this is one that's really fresh, but it's been popping up a lot, and it's so fun to play, and it's really good in this format right now, where again you're afforded a few turns in the early game, by and large, to sort of get a plan going, and that's a really decent format for a card like Risen Reef, for instance. So this deck ramps pretty well and has a great late game plan. It's kind of an Agent of Treachery deck, like a lot of the other decks in this format, but it goes about getting to Agent of Treachery in a really interesting way, like it's not all about Agent of Treachery, it's about playing elementals, it's about making Omnath a good card, it's about making Genesis Ultimatum a good card, and whether or not you hit Agent or not, it's decent. You might hit 2 Risen Reef and a Healer of the Glade and a Omnath or something off your Genesis Ultimatum. So even if you don't hit Agent, the deck has so many amazing things to hit off of Ultimatum, like Cavalier of Thorns, for instance, that Genesis Ultimatum is almost always going to be an amazing play, and it's really easy to get to in this deck. It's fairly easy to get to 7 mana in this format right now, so long as you have the proper ramp pieces and all that. And Temur Elementals definitely does. So I'm surprised to see this deck as much as I've been seeing it lately, but it's been producing results consistently enough over this 12-day and not quite 2 weeks span that I definitely think it's worth mentioning and taking very, very seriously. I know that it kind of was disappointing in a recent standard challenge event. Because this deck did show up, but it didn't show up anywhere in the top 16, I think. So I think a lot of people are starting to write it off, but I think it's a really, really bad idea. Might not be the best teamer deck in the format, but it definitely does some really powerful things and has a lot of different dimensions to it. There's a lot of different angles of attack that this deck can approach from, and I really respect that about it. So I've always been a fan of Temur Elementals. It's always needed kind of a leg up, and I think the introduction of Agent of Treachery and Genesis Ultimatum to the deck really give the deck some late game things that it needed to be able to do, sink its mana into some really big profitable spells, because it never really was able to do that before. So it really got the things that it needed to make its late game even better, and it already had a late game with all the mana and cards in the world, so it didn't really need much help, but the help that it got really propelled it to a much higher status. Up next in the B tier, let's talk about Soultie thing, like Soultie ramp mid-range control. It's sort of a lot of different decks, but this is, I guess, the first Euro deck that we'll talk about, because Euro is still definitely a force in the format. And we've seen, the Euro decks go one of two ways. You either play Euro into Fairy, right? Or instead of adding white, you add black. So that you get, usually Casualties of War is the big attraction there. And Casualties is a really good card in this format, where you're afforded the couple of turns that you need to ramp into it. And once you do hit it, you might hit, a Fires of Invention, and a Yorion, and a Teferi, and a land, and possibly even an artifact, and you never know. So Casualties just really, we're in a format right now where you cast Casualties, you'll get a 4-for-1 some of the time. Because everyone's playing a pretty good spread of things, you might hit a Witch's Oven, and a creature, and a land, and a Planeswalker. You never know. So Casualties is just a really fantastic Magic card. And I think it's the entire reason that this deck still exists, but this is sort of where the Simic decks kind of dumped off to in some ways, because this is also still usually the Nissa Who Shakes the World deck and the Hydroid Krasis deck, that also plays Growth Spiral and Euro. Often will play Agent of Treachery, but sometimes doesn't, It's sometimes more control-oriented that plays, a lot more instants and sorceries, usually removal spells and whatnot. But often the win condition will either be a Planeswalker, like Nissa, or you'll just hit a huge Hydroid Krasis, or even a Pelucranos will show up in these decks. So there's a lot of, varied win conditions in these Soultie decks right now. And honestly, I'd say Soultie is one of those decks that's a really good deck almost no matter how you build it, because a different Soultie deck, a deck that's literally 4 whole cards different from the last iteration of Soultie. Well, 5-0, almost every MTGO league, every time you're gonna see, not every time, but a lot of times you'll see one Soultie deck in the MTGO league results. They're usually built somewhat differently. But they always do like fairly well, and the philosophy is really interesting in this format. I think that the sort of Casualties of War game plan and then just a bunch of other good cards on top of that is a pretty good place to be. But I don't think that Soultie is the best deck by any stretch, but it's definitely a deck that, given like on the right day, can definitely win a tournament. But it's top 8'd a few already, so Soultie's a very serious deck, but I think that it's sort of just off of the cusp of being like one of the legit actual best decks in the format. But heading up the B tier, the best deck in B tier is Bant Yorion, I'll call it. I've actually called this subjectively the best deck in the format. I think that it might be. But I'm going again mostly by results here and by how decks have done lately. And Bant Yorion is a deck that doesn't do well in either category, or at least not as much as I'd like it to. Bant Yorion saw really, really good results like 10 days ago. I think it was probably it was either a week ago or 10 days ago or so. Was the last time Bant Yorion saw really good results. But there was a point where Bant Yorion was like 6 out of the top 8 decks at like 3 different events. So Bant Yorion may have had its moment in the sun. Maybe people are moving on to another Yorion deck specifically, but we'll talk about that one later. But I think that, we were just talking about the Casualties of War decks that are basically Euro decks that added black for casualties and a couple of other like removal pieces. Well, the other philosophy with the Euro decks was again to add white so you could play Teferi. And these Bant Yorion decks are just the best evolution of that philosophy that we've seen so far. If you're going to play the Euro deck, this is probably the best Euro deck that you can play. And yeah, it plays 80 cards because it plays Yorion as a companion. We're really going to be getting into the companion decks now. But it's not like we haven't already talked about a bunch of them, but still. Bant Yorion, you'd think, oh, it wants to play Elspeth Conquers Death, it wants to play Teferi, it wants to play Euro, but there's 80 cards in the deck, so it's going to get to its best cards less often. And that's just not really the case because there's not any bad cards in the deck. We also get to play Growth Spiral and just a bunch of like Shatter the Sky. And it's really easy to make an 80-card deck with these 3 colors because there's just not a bad card in the entire deck. There's nothing that you have to, we'll play this for synergy. No, just every card is amazing. So it's one of those decks. And I think that in terms of like pure control decks, which it's not, it's kind of a mid-range deck, but in terms of like the most controlling decks we have in the format right now, the Bant Yorion is probably the best bet if you are one of those control players. And it really has answers for just about everything. And even though it hasn't been producing as many results as I would have liked lately, I'm still going to sort of make it head up the B tier here. I really want to put it in A tier. But I think that, last week it would have been in A tier. But now it's in B tier because that's how quickly the format is evolving. Let's get into A tier, everybody. The best of the best decks. There's actually 2 tiers left because there is an S tier this time around. There's not always an S tier. There actually is this time, but the A tier is comprised of 5, really 4.5, sort of. We'll talk about it. Like, just amazing freaking decks. Starting with Rakdos Aristocrats. Now, this deck is actually 2 decks. This isn't even what I was talking about when I said the 4.5 decks, but Rakdos is one of 2 decks right now. There's the deck that plays Lurrus as a companion, and is, thus relegated to only 2-mana things and doesn't get to play Mayhem Devil. And then there's the one that I think is better, and that's the one that does play Mayhem Devil and doesn't play Lurrus as the companion. Instead, it plays Obosh as the companion, so it only plays, 1 and 3 and 5 drops. And I think that is definitely the better deck, especially if we're being objective just in terms of results. You'll see the Lurrus Rakdos Aristocrats deck in MTGO League standings every now and again, but in terms of actual like top 8 finishes in events and challenges and online events that vendors are putting on right now, the Obosh Mayhem Devil deck has really produced a lot better results all in all than the one that plays Lurrus as the companion. So I'm going to make this entry the Obosh Rakdos Aristocrats deck, but both decks have produced results. Like, both decks are pretty good, but just, both objectively based on results and subjectively based on my opinion and my educated opinion. Semi-educated opinion. I think that the Mayhem Devil, the one that gets to play Mayhem Devil, is the much better sacrifice deck. So take that how you will. But this is definitely a deck that's been around long enough in this format and produced results consistently enough that it definitely deserves to be in the A tier. But amazingly, there are better decks than this in the A tier. This is where that like half a deck thing comes in that I was talking about earlier. Because I can't really decide which deck is better, mono black Obosh or mono red Obosh. However, again, if we're trying to be objective here, I think mono black Obosh just has more results. It was also the #1 mythic deck for a good time there, and that means a lot to me, at least. I don't know how much it means to you, but being #1 mythic in the world and holding that position for days is pretty impressive. So some would make the argument this is mono black Obosh. Sorry, Ziggy. Is actually like the best deck in the format. You gotta let go. You got big sharp claws, buddy. But I'm not sure about that. I don't think the best deck in the format is an aggro deck right now, but this is definitely where we're getting into like the no bones about it, absolute best decks. Even on a mediocre day, these decks can beat some of the actual best decks in the format, because I think they are. The mono red Obosh deck is pretty good. I mean, it looks sweet. You get to play Phoenix of Ash. You get to play Anax and Scorch Spitter and a bunch of like really cool stuff. You get to play Heraldic Banner in that deck too. But all in all, for my money, I think the mono black one is just a million times better. You get Shadow Spear in the main deck a lot of the time, but Rotting Regisar plus maybe Shadow Spear plus Obosh is just like disgusting. It's a really disgusting combination, but you've got all these really good one-drops too. You got Serrated Scorpion, you've got Whisper Squad, you've got Gutter Bones and Knight of the Ebon Legion. It just forms a really good aggro basis. You get down your Heraldic Banner on turn 3, and you tap it to play another Knight of the Ebon Legion or whatever. Next turn, since you've ramped from Heraldic Banner, you play your Obosh, and you swing in for 1,000,000. This deck has a lot of like really interesting wrinkles, and it can play like a mindless aggro deck that just plays a bunch of one-drops into, an Anthem effect like Heraldic Banner, and then throws down, Obosh as sort of a substitute for Torbrand, kind of, is how it feels. It can play that way, just curve out and play small creatures. Or it can play a slightly longer game as well, because it's got some removal elements to it. And it's got these like giant haymakers, again, like Rotting Regisar plus Obosh, or Rotting Regisar plus Shadow Spear, which are just like, those are insane plays. Just completely take over the game and win against other aggro decks in a lot of situations. So I really like a lot of what Mono Black Obosh is doing, and I do think it's easily one of the best decks in the format, but is it the best deck? I don't think so. But we're kind of rounding the corner. We've only got like 4 more decks to talk about in this whole stinking video here, and up next, let's talk about Temur Reclamation, y'all. Just a deck that will not go away. Like, every time I do a tier list video, I'm like, I'm not sure how good Temur Reclamation is. But for the first time, I can say that I think Temur Reclamation is in, like, real, like, fighting shape. It got the things that it needed, man. Shark Typhoon was so good. Such a good pickup for that deck. And, like, nowadays, you'll see a lot of variants in the Temur Reclamation lists, right? Like, some of them will play a bunch of counter spells. Some of them will play Nightpack Ambusher. They're kind of a weird amalgamation of Simic Flash and Temur Reclamation. Some of them have gone down to like 2 copies of Expansion Explosion. Not all of them, but 2 copies of Expansion Explosion to like sort of be Temur Adventures, sort of be Simic Flash. It's such a weird deck because they also play like Brazen Borrower and Bone Crusher Giant and stuff. And along with like Nightpack Ambusher, they just kill you with their creatures sometimes. They'll throw down a couple of creatures, Nightpack Ambusher, counter your big play, just kill you that way. It's so good. Or like Shark Typhoon if the game gets really late. And they'll draw, a card and have this huge dude out. And it's a good defensive play. It's a good offensive play, depending on where they are in the game. And of course, they can always just Wilderness Reclamation. Stack the triggers, tap for a bunch of mana, explosion you for 1,000,000. They still got that play. So there's just so many different wrinkles to this deck and so many like angles of attack. So many different approaches that I've just really grown to really respect and like Temur Reclamation as a deck. It's not the most fun deck to play on Arena. For some reason, stacking the triggers is like really stressful to me. Making sure that you hold priority at all the right times, like it's not the most fun deck to play on Arena in the world, but it is a really powerful deck with a lot of interesting, sort of unconventional answers. It's a deck unlike any other in the format. And even though I haven't respected it much in the past, even though it's been on the tier lists and in pretty high spots, I've always had this air of like, I don't like this deck. This is a stupid deck. And, like, I don't feel that way anymore. Temur Reclamation has just, like, really impressed me in its ability to, not only evolve, but just remain a force in this format and the last format and the one before that for a while now. Team Reclamation has been a deck that you have to plan for. So, I mean, I'm kind of just as amazed as you might be, but Team Reclamation has been producing results very consistently, still producing results to this day, still evolving to this day, and it is definitely one of the best decks. But earlier I said that Winoda was like the best meme deck in the format, but I guess I forgot about the ultimate meme deck, because at the very, very top of the A tier, one of the like seriously top 3 decks in the format according to this video and the results, is amazingly Lurrus cycling. How did that happen? How did we let that happen? But it's just the truth, you know? If you look at any MTGO League results standings, very often, multiple versions of this deck will have 5-0'd, right? Like a Jeskai version, a Mardu version, a 4-color version, 5-color version, like that I've seen twice now, which is weird. But, you know, sometimes just Boros builds of this deck will 5-0. So it very consistently 5-0s, and very often like 3 different type of builds of the deck will be represented in the league result. But it also does really well in standard challenges. It's done amazingly in online events, almost the entire format since people have started playing the deck, which is like 2 weeks after the format started. I was an early proponent of this deck, by the way. I was one of the first people to tweet out that this deck is very good, and it is. It turns out. Although at the time I said, this might not be the best deck in the format. I might have been wrong. It might have been. There was a recent online event that I might fudge the numbers slightly here, but I believe there were 36 players in the event. 8 of them were on a cycling deck of some kind. And combined, their cumulative game 1 win percentage was 73%. And I know I got that number right. It was like 73 point something percent in game 1 for all those decks combined. So if you want a strong best of 1 or just strong deck in game 1, this is the actual absolute best deck in the format for those purposes. And the deck does stomp in best of 1 for anyone that's played it in best of 1, and I have a lot. This deck is very, very good in that environment. As far as games 2 and 3, the deck doesn't really have much of a side game plan to speak of. But so there's some issues, but you know, the deck is a lot more consistent than people give it credit for. You know, everyone just thought this was a Zenith Flare deck. It's not. You know, it's a turn 1 Flourishing Fox, turn 2 Valiant Rescuer, turn 3 I have all the things, right? It's just, you know, I have a giant Flourishing Fox and 2 tokens when it's, you know, your go on turn 3, and you know, you chip away at their life total with combat damage and stingers and stuff. You pressure them with Flourishing Foxes, or you hold down the fort with Flourishing Foxes, don't let them attack in and stuff like that. You can trade your creatures in combat pretty liberally, because you can just like Lurrus and get your Valiant Rescuer back or whatever. And Rescuer trades with so many things in the early game that you don't care about throwing it away, because you're going to get it back and they're not going to get their creature back. This deck just has a lot of like interesting piloting wrinkles to it that people really don't give the deck credit for, even to this day. People think this is a brainless deck, but there's actually a lot of decisions you have to make when piloting this deck. Do I play this Stinger or do I cycle it? Do I play this Valiant Rescuer or do I cycle it? Usually you play the Valiant Rescuer and cycle the Stinger. Or the healer. You cycle the healer a lot. You play the Stinger a lot. But, yeah, you know, a lot of people were just turn 1 cycle, turn 2 cycle, turn 3 cycle, turn 4 Zenith Flare. It's not how you play the deck. You know, you have to play out your stuff. Flourishing Fox into Stinger, Valiant Rescuer, or whatever. And then if your opponent kills those things, you either get them back with Lurrus, or if you get your Sky Shattered or your Clarion Deafeninged or whatever, then they're just putting a bunch of cards with cycling into your graveyard, and that makes your Zenith Flares bigger. So there's been a lot of, you know, sort of learning and evolving with this deck over the last couple of weeks. Originally it was just a Boros deck. Then people started adding the Jeskai mana so you could play Boon of the Wishgiver if you wanted to. Then people started making it a 4-color deck so you could play the cycling thing that makes them discard a card, but no one ever actually plays that card. No one. So, I mean, it's just, again, it's evolved a lot from a purely budget form at first to a deck that is now like finely tuned and wins 73% of game 1s. So this is a very, very real deck. And I didn't expect it to be, but you've got to give the devil its due. I mean, cycling, again, consistently produces lots and lots of results in small ball tournaments and league results alike. So, believe it or not, Jeskai Cycling is serious, actual, real contender for best deck in the format. Well, let's get to the S tier, ladies and gentlemen. There's actually an S tier this time around. And we'll start it off, there are only 2 decks in this tier, but we'll start it off with Keruga Fires, which for a long time I would have sworn to you was the best deck in the format. But the last like 2 weeks have proven that there is a slightly better deck than this, but they're both very similar decks. Right. This version obviously just plays Karuga as the companion. This is the Fires deck that we're all sort of most familiar with, I think, at this point. It is almost card for card the same Fires deck that we've seen forever now. It feels like just it added Keruga as its companion. There's not really that many new cards in the mix. A couple here and there. But for the most part, this deck has been strong for months and months and months now. It has, I think in the last tier list, it was in the top tier. The one before that, it was in the tier below top tier, and it should have been top tier. And I'm not making that mistake again. I mean, Fires is still like, if not the best deck in the format, then it's at least the other best deck in the format. The play sequences this deck can generate are just nearly unbeatable under a lot of circumstances. So Fires is still a very strong deck that plays a lot of very strong cards, and even if it doesn't get its Fires of Invention, it's still, will outplay a lot of opponents just by playing some of the strongest creatures and planeswalkers in the format and kind of making things insurmountable. The early game plan of either Teferi or Deafening Clarion really throws a lot of decks off of their game plan, even if they have cards like Lurrus that allow them to recast stuff, or like, Rakdos Sacrifice casts like Call of the Death Dweller a lot of the time to get its stuff back. But even with cards like that, the Fires deck has just proven to be way too strong in its early and mid-game plan for a lot of these, smaller aggro decks to really keep up with, because you got Deafening Clarion and Shatter the Sky in a lot of these decks. Some of them still carry Time Wipe as well. So you just got all these sweepers, along with just the biggest, nastiest dudes. Once you get down Fires of Invention, Cavalier, Kenrith, Sphinx of Insight, or whatever, or Foresight, then it's just really, really difficult to actually do anything out from under that if you're the opponent. So Fires is just still an embarrassingly good deck right now. And I think that it's possible that Fires of Invention is too good of a card, but I'm not calling for it to be banned or anything. It's just such an insane, meta-changing, meta-defining card right now that you really can't get away from it. And I know that on the lower tiers of Arena, you don't see this deck as often, and that's for a few reasons. But if you get into the upper tiers, and once you actually start looking at results from tournaments and MTGO League results, this is an overrepresented deck that is literally everywhere. So if it's not the best deck in the format, it's the other best deck. Which means there must be an actual best deck in the format. And for the time being, just with the caveat that, again, Standard is evolving very quickly right now. So a week or 2 weeks from now, this deck could be nowhere. Maybe there's a completely new deck. Who knows? But for the time being, I think that a deck with a ridiculously long name is the best deck in the format. Just 4-color Lukka Fires and then Yorion in parentheses. This is a Yorion Fires of Invention deck. It plays Yorion as its companion instead of Karuga, so it has to play a bunch of cards. But it also plays Lukka to try and get Agent of Treachery as quickly as possible. Is usually the goal there. But it also plays a bunch of control-y elements and some of the other elements that Fires of Invention is kind of used to playing. It's 80 card slots. So in some ways, it's just a 4-color Fires deck. In some ways, it's a Yorion deck. In some ways, it's a Lukka into Agent of Treachery deck. There's so many things that it does. If it hits Lukka, sometimes it can just hit Agent of Treachery that very same turn off of, an Elspeth Sun's Champion token or a Omen of the Sun token. Sometimes it'll play Birth of Melodus. It'll sacrifice the 0/4, but it doesn't actually really play creatures other than Agent of Treachery. So when you exile one of your tokens to Lukka, you're guaranteed to hit an agent. So that's probably the deck's primary plan. But there's also, playing a bunch of Planeswalkers and stuff like Omen of the Sea. Again, Birth of Melodus. Sometimes you'll see Omen of the Sun in here, but not as often as you used to. And you just play your Yorion, and you reset all of those things. You draw more cards off of Omen of the Sea, you get more planes and whatever off of Birth of Melodus. You reset your Planeswalker loyalty and all that. So that's another plan that the deck has. Elspeth Conquers Death, the deck will play, and it can reset Elspeth Conquers Death and exile another thing due to Yorion. So, and sometimes Yorion is just a win condition that flies over for 4 a turn and wins that way. The deck plays, Shatter the Sky, Deafening Clarion. It's just in some ways very similar to the Fires deck that we're used to, but it cuts down a bit on Kenriths and Cavaliers and Sphinxes and stuff like that. It's not trying to get these big attack step turns necessarily. It's just trying to demoralize the opponent by getting all the value in the world off of Yorion or getting Agent early in the game off of Lukka. And even though the deck doesn't usually win outright on those big turns, the same way that like Fires of Invention will win all in one turn off of like getting 2 Cavalier of Flame down, or like a Kenrith and a Cavalier on the same turn. And you just win on that attack step. This deck won't necessarily win the turn that it gets Agent of Treachery or anything, but usually the turn that it gets Agent of Treachery, it's also got a buttload of other strong cards in its hand to then protect its sort of position in the game. So it's just, again, a deck that doesn't play a single bad card even though it plays 80 cards. It just doesn't play a single bad card, and no matter what it does draw, even if it doesn't get Lukka, right? If it doesn't get the sort of game plan that it's going for, it's still drawing a bunch of like amazing cards. And so, sometimes this is the other sort of Euro deck in the format. So there's a lot of different ways this deck is built. Sometimes you'll even see like a 5-color Yorions that play Fires and Lukka and Agent and all that. But for the most part, people are keeping it down to 4 colors. But over the last like 2 weeks or so, this deck has been everywhere. It's been all over the MTGO League results. There was an online event. I think it was the LATAM Open. I might be mistaken there. But there was a recent online event just in the last week where it was like 6 out of the top 8 decks. So there's that. Been doing really well in not only the league, but in challenges on MTGO as well lately. So just again, in the last really 7 to 10 days, this deck has just exploded in popularity. It's freaking everywhere, and it's not only top 8ing, it's top 8ing multiple times, and it's winning as well. So just a really freaking strong deck right now that looks to be the best deck in the format in terms of pure results, playability, like the amount of play that it's actually seeing. Not just the results that it's generating, but the number of players on the deck is extremely high right now. And it's consistently producing very, very good results as well. And even though it's not like really an established deck in this format, it hasn't been around since the beginning of the season. It's relatively new. I still think that it's been around just long enough to take it seriously as the most important deck in the format right now. Like if you're looking to win Standard, you have to beat these Fires of Invention decks, and I think this is probably the best Fires of Invention deck. And that's really like the battle for Standard right now is like, what is the best Fires of Invention deck? That's kind of the question that you have to answer. And again, right now, I think that this 4-color Yorion as your companion, Lukka to get Agent of Treachery, like the deck has a lot going on, but I still think it's the best deck in the format. And again, I think the results over the last couple of weeks back up that subjective opinion with objective data. So that's my take for now. Other than like, I need to talk briefly about like how I feel about Standard in total, because there's been so much talk on Twitter and on Reddit lately about like, is this format good or not? Do you like companions? Because companions are really like the big sticking point for a lot of players. Do companions completely ruin the game or not? I don't think so. I think the companions are probably a bit too strong, yes. But I wouldn't go banning anything except maybe Yorion and Lurrus. If I was going to ban anything companion-wise, be Yorion and Lurrus, but that's only if I was absolutely forced to do that. I don't know that we have to go doing that right now. If I was going to ban any card in this format right now, it'd probably be Fires of Invention, to be honest. But again, that's only if I was absolutely forced to do that. I think that we're actually in a fairly healthy format, and that's what I really wanted to touch on here at the end, is that companions are everywhere, yes, right? And there are Fires of Invention decks in this format. There's like 3 different Fires of Invention decks. There's like 3 or 4 different Lurrus decks in the format. But I've still gone over here 15 different decks that all are some of the best decks in the format. Like, with the exception of a couple of decks sort of in the lower tiers, pretty much any of these decks could win a tournament like today or tomorrow. And it wouldn't be like too shocking to anyone. So I think that the decks are kind of clustered together without there being this huge amount of separation between the tiers like you sometimes see. That's a good sign. There are 15 viable decks, which is a good sign. And like I've said a million times in this video, enough that it's probably getting old, the format is evolving like quickly. Like the format evolves every single week, and there's either a new deck or a new way to build a deck, to cut these 4 cards and put in these 4 cards. So decks are evolving and new decks are cropping up like all the time. So that to me is a healthy format. I know companions are everywhere, but when there's 15 decks, this kind of evolution, I think that's a sign of a fairly healthy format. You might not like the cycling deck, you might not like the Yorion deck, the Fires decks. You might not like the mono black deck. I don't know what you like, but there are definitely decks that are hateable. But it doesn't change the fact that they're like the best decks in the format. And it also doesn't change the fact that there are a lot of different choices to play right now. So I understand that companions being so ubiquitous and just ever present, which is a synonym for ubiquitous. But anyway, I think that the companions being everywhere does sort of harsh the vibe a little bit, and not everyone's into that by any stretch. But I think that if you're just looking at the total number of viable decks in the format right now, and the speed at which the format is adapting and changing, then I think we've got all the hallmarks of like a pretty healthy and diverse standard right now. So again, that's just my 2 cents. If companions are enough to completely override all those things, I actually kind of understand that, because companions make for what feel like really stale play patterns. But I mean, it's also information at the start of a game. You know, that there's a lot of like wrinkles with companions that we haven't like fully explored yet. Because, you know, maybe I'm more likely to take or not take a mulligan if I'm playing aggro, and I know that my opponent is playing like Lurrus or Obosh or Yorion or something like that, you know. So just that little piece of information at the beginning of the game actually means a lot too. So there's so many like things to talk about with companion. But if you're just not into it, I get that, because again, they make for stale matchups, stale play patterns, or at least it feels that way. But at least we've got a large spread of decks for those play patterns to play out over. So, you know, take that how you will. I think that the standard environment looks pretty good right now, but I'm looking forward to Core Set 2021 to see like what's added, what answers there are, and all that. But still, we're at pretty much the halfway point in this meta right now, and I think it's looking pretty good. But let me know how you felt about everything. If certain decks should be higher, if certain decks should be included that weren't even included. Because you could probably get to 20 decks. If you were dedicated enough making this video, you could probably get up to 20 decks, but I just really didn't think, like, Garuda is probably the bottom of the barrel, and I don't want to go any farther than that. I mean, I guess you could make the argument that, like, the black-white Lurrus deck that plays, like, all the glitters and Hateful Eidolon and stuff should be on here somewhere, because it hits the league results sometimes, but I don't think so. I think we hit the actual 15 best decks in the format, but just let me know if you think that there should be other decks on here, if the order should be flipped around or whatever. Remember, if you want to see any deck lists, or now that the set's out, you can order any of these decks. All the deck lists, 15 different deck lists, are going to be in the description down there. That's going to require a lot of work on my part. So do your part and click those links, because it helps you do that when you order cards from those links. And do all the other stuff. You know, like the video, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Make sure you hit the bell for notifications, because apparently YouTube wants it to be a 2-step authentication process. Authentication process. I don't know why, but that's how it is. So do both the things. Check out the Patreon, link in the description. If you want to support content like this, $1 a month to choose what content we do in the first place, through voting and whatnot. So yeah, but yeah, that's pretty much it. I was actually able to do it. I've been dreading doing this tier list video for a while now, but I think we finally got it kicked out, and I probably have already spent like way too much time talking. About like 55 minutes on this Audacity file right now. That's a lot. So I'm going to stop and shut up, and you can tell me how you feel. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.